I have a copy of the East India Company translation. It was done by Charles Stewart. So this book is from 1810. It comes in 3 volumes. And if you look at the frontispiece, there's an engraving of Mirza Abu Talib. And if you look closely at it, you'll see that he's wearing a dagger. And to his right, there is an already prepared manuscript book for him to write this particular book in. And if you look on to his left, there's a very vague, strange-looking set of fighting elephants. This frontispiece engraving was derived from a portrait that was done of Abu Talib by a man named James Northcote. For Mirza Abu Talib to have his portrait painted by someone as prominent as Northcote, that means that he has a certain status. He's a worthy subject for this kind of painter. He's wearing the dagger, right? That's probably a prop. It's meant to signify his elevated status, which is actually kind of fictional, right? The book beside him is meant to emphasize his importance as a scholar. So if the dagger represents his heroic masculinity, then the book beside him represents his scholarly credentials.
أنا صاحب الشعر والنثر، ذو الأصل التركي، المولود في أصفهان، بازغ النجم في الهند. أنا أمير فارسي غريب في بلاد بعيدة، وسيد لندني في بلادي. أنا العامل في إمبراطورية المغول، والمقيم المثير للفضول في بلاط الإنكليز، والزائر الذي حل بباب بني عثمان. أنا سائح متفكر وجل في بلاد العالمين. قد أكون كل هذا أو بعضه. هؤلاء السادة من ذوي النظر تتبعوا أخباري، ربما يستفيضون في الرواية.
Abu Talib Khan was a traveler. He's known most importantly as a traveler.
He was a Muslim man who grew up in Lucknow.
What you might call a minor nobleman who had families who worked for the local Nawab, or that is prince, in Lucknow in the Indian state of Awadh.
He was born to an Iranian family who had immigrated from Iran to India.
He was trained as a translator, a scholar. He became a poet.
His family traditionally has been working for the Mughal Empire, which dominated India at this time period. Of course, as the British were at the very beginning process of consolidating power in that region. There were a number of political intrigues and local politics that eventually drove him and his family to persecution. He had to, on multiple occasions, leave Lucknow and move to Calcutta.
The period is late in the 18th century.
The Mughal Empire had been fracturing for a number of years, and there were a number of competing principalities.
And that had to do with the intervention of the British East India Company.
The East India Company is the initial forerunner of the eventual takeover of the Indian subcontinent by British.
Started out in 1600 with a charter from the Queen of England as basically a trading factory.
Where they had total control of territories pretty much from, South Africa all the way through the Indian Ocean.
As the 18th century went on, the company became increasingly more powerful.
Was almost a state of its own. It had its own army, its own economic apparatus, obviously, its own commercial routes.
He worked for the East India Company for a large period of time.
But eventually, even that didn't work out. And the British eventually, given their own self-interest, did not really care about helping him and his family further. And it was at that point when Abu Talib fell into a deep state of depression, had no job, was practically unemployed.
عاد الحاكم الإنجليزي العام الذي كان على صلة بي إلى إنكلترا. بت وحيدة، فقد هجرني الأصدقاء لما فارقتني حظوظ الحياة، وذهب المال، وزاد الهم بوفاة ابني ذو ال4 سنوات. وتركني الكل، عائلتي وخدمي.
He said, I might as well just go out, travel in the world, and, maybe I'll die in a ship somewhere and disappear.
Embarked on a remarkable journey at the very end of the 18th century.
He was actually financed by East India Company or people associated with East India Company.
What prompted him to go to England, besides the fact of dealing with his depression and personal issues and being a tourist, was also to network with the East India Company and aristocrats and powerful power brokers. Abu Talib Khan was not a fan of traveling by ship.
The journey itself, look at any journey in the 18th century by ship, is a tough matter.
كان ربان سفينتنا فيه تكبر، عكس نائبه الذي كان محبوب الخلق وحاذقا في مهنة الملاحة، وهو أيضا عكس النائب الثاني والمساعدين الذين كانوا جهلة بالمهنة إلى جوار سوء أدبهم.
His ship ran into different, multiple, varied and successive storms at sea.
خضنا عاصفة شديدة في خضم الموج ل3 أيام، ومما عانيته فيها سقوط إنجليزي ضخم الجثة علي. هذا الرجل كان جاري، وكان دائم الصراخ علي إذا ما علا صوتي قليلا.
He's not fully welcomed on the ship, and he has this lovely moment where he's sort of describing some people are willing to talk to me and some people aren't.
غرفتي كانت ضيقة لا تدخلها الشمس، معطنة بكل ما يخالف الصحة، وكان خدم السفينة لا يعتنون بنظافتها، ولضيقها كان مكان الحيوانات غير ذي بعيد منا. لم يكن ممكنا لنا غير الأوروبيين أن نحلق أو نقلم أظافرنا، وكان علينا أن نأكل بالشوكة والسكين، ولم يكن لنا مكان مناسب للاغتسال.
It was very difficult under those circumstances to do the ritual prayer of purification that Muslims traditionally do.
From India to Cape Town.
Passed through colonized spaces in South Africa, also in Ireland.
And then spent almost a year and a half in London.
في يناير كانون الثاني عام 1800 كان عبوري إلى إنكلترا. كان وصولي إلى حاضرة الإنكليز بعد سنة إلا 5 أيام من إبحاري من كلكتة، في رحلة توقفت فيها في كيب تاون وأيرلندا. مكثت 7 أشهر في دار حوت حماما باردا وساخنا في آن، لكني تشاجرت مع صاحبها وتنقلت بين الدور، وبعد استقراري كتبت لأحد وزراء المملكة فعين لي موعده. حينها كانت بداية سياحتي في هذه البلاد.
Abu Talib received tremendous attention through the British elite and the press and local newspapers, and he became a minor celebrity.
If we look at the newspapers of the day, we see that the English people, right, so the press, describe him in similar ways.
He was called the Persian Prince.
The Persian Prince.
The Persian Prince.
They call him the Persian Prince, first of all, because he speaks Persian. And Persian is the common language Iran and Central Asia and India.
He had this fictional persona that was bestowed on him by Londoners. And it's a persona that he performed in public.
The bourgeois public sphere in Europe is also interested in figures like Abu Talib Khan because he is an oddity, he's a strange phenomenon.
They wanted to be out in public to see and be seen with the so-called Persian Prince. It was the famous Georgina Spencer, the Duchess of Devonshire, who first gave him the idea to write a diary about his tour and told him to keep notes about all the things he's learning.
We got highly detailed physical description of London and detailed description of its social spaces.
عاصمة هذه البلاد هي لندن. لم أعرف مدينة بكبرها. جل دورها مبنية بالآجر وعلى الأغلب بطوابق 4، وفي وجهاتها تنتظم النوافذ وسطوحها من طبقة مائلة من القرميد. أزقتها وشوارعها ومتاجرها تنار في المساء، وقد وصلت حداً لا يتصور من الفخامة. تعمر بالميادين، وفي وسط كل ميدان بستان مسيج بالحديد، مفتاحه لدى أصحاب الدور المجاورة، وتستطيع السيدات التنزه فيه مع أطفالهن في أي ساعة دون خوف.
He is interested, for example, in factories, in hospitals, in schools, in social gatherings, in cafes, in streets.
He describes what it's like to go to the theater with famous people. He describes what it's like to go to the pleasure gardens.
He spent a lot of time feasting and partying with aristocrats.
هذه المدينة في حقيقتها 3 مدن: مدينة لندن العتيقة، وويستمنستر، والأرباض. المدينة العتيقة مسورة وفيها كبار التجار، ولها قاضيها الخاص الملقب باللورد، ولها مجلس يضم كبار الملاك وأرباب الحرف من أهل البرجواز، وفيها مئات من البنوك يتعاملون مع العالم كله، على رأسها بنك إنكلترا الذي يضم نحو 200 مكتب، والمشتركون فيه يؤلفون الشركة مثل شركة الهند الشرقية، وفيه تودع السلطات كنوز الوطن التي يقال إنها لا تقل عن 100 مليون استرليني. وهناك البورصة أيضاً التي يجتمع فيها التجار يومياً لعقد الصفقات والاطلاع على أخبار التجارة والسياسة.
Because his former friends in the East India Company, he has access to rich and famous people.
He met with the monarch,
King George III.
and they were just entertained by his presence.
حضرت إلى بلاط الملك جورج الثالث والملكة تشارلوت اللذان شرفاني بإلزام الحضور ومحادثتهما، ورغم استصحابي لمترجم إلا أنهما كانا يطلبان مني أن أجيبهما بإنجليزية الضعيفة التي كانا يفهمانها.
He met with officials in the government.
He met all the major power holders at that time.
He meets the Secretary of State for the Southern region.
Most importantly, he met with the high-ranking officials of the East India Company.
He describes being invited to the Prince of Wales's breakfast party on such and such a date, and he talks about how he's made one of the principal figures of this event.
ومما أعجبني ما يسمى بالنوادي المؤلفة من أرباب مذهب أو عمل واحد، يتقابلون شهريا لمداولة شؤونهم، ومنهم أهل الفن وأهل الأدب وغيرهم، ولا يدخلها الشخص إلا بدعوة خاصة، وينتخبون أعضاءها بالتسمية المكتوبة. كما تعرفت على الأحرار الماسونيين الذي يحكى العجب عنهم، وقد حاولوا ضمي لكني رفضت هذا الشرف خوفا من عدم اتساق مبادئهم مع طرقي في الحياة.
He's one of the people invited to a celebration of Lord Nelson's victory at Abu Qir in Londoners knew as the Battle of the Nile. Of course, this story is all over the news. And in Mirza Abu Talib's account, he makes it seem as though the celebration is partly because he's there.
One of the things that really stuck out to him when he was there was the sciences, and particularly physics, and particularly the discoveries in heliocentric models of the universe that have been discovered by Copernicus and developed later by Sir Isaac Newton.
هناك جمعيات أخرى مثل الجمعية الملكية في لندن التي تختبر فيها الاختراعات وتصلح فيها الأخطاء ويجتمع إليها العلماء لتحكيم أعمالهم. وقد دعاني رئيس الجمعية مرات عدة لحضور ناديهم ما أنزل علي الابتهاج.
Much of his descriptions of England has to do with social issues and economic issues and political issues. For example, the nature of government, parliamentary democracy is extremely important to him.
حضرت جلسات مجلس العموم ومثلها في بيت اللواردة، إذ يكون انعقاد البرلمان في أول الدور ونهايته، ويحضر الملك هذين اليومين باحتفال يتراص فيه الموظفون العموميون والنواب والأمراء والأشراف والسفراء، والكل ينصت لخطبة الملك باحترام.
The way he was able to reach these powerful male politicians and parliamentarians and courtiers was via women, elite women, who were in a sense power brokers and intermediaries. So he also spent considerable time at these lavish aristocratic parties, at the theaters.
Why is he talking about women all the time? Like, why is this the biggest issue for him? You could start with an answer that said, you know, women in these parties and public places were extraordinarily captivating.
He is in his 20s when he's there. He's as much interested in women in Paris and London and elsewhere as he would be in Iran or in India. To me, is more an indication, number one, of the presence of women in public space that interested him, in cafes, in restaurants, in streets.
This was a time period where women of the upper classes were very involved in the local politics at the time, even including in imperial politics. Abu Talib Khan had numerous encounters and discussions with the British about their views on Islam and what Islam represents.
جلست أسقف لندن، هذا العاقل الفيلسوف الذي كان من بواعث سروري أن أناقشه في مسائل الدين.
Well, the Bishop of London just, kind of laughed at him when Abu Talib said, no, I'm not going to be converting to Christianity. And then the Bishop of London retorts back and says, well, maybe you've just arrived here in London to convert all of us to Islam. And they kind of have a chuckle and a laugh at that. In his travel diary, he talks about the virtues and vices of the English.
He's neither Europhobic nor is Eurocentric. He doesn't have an agenda. He's not on a mission to prove, oh, the British are horrible, or no, the British are God's gift to humanity.
A lot of things that he sees as virtues of the English, he also simultaneously sees as vices. So, for example, he spends a lot of time being around fashionable company, and Britons who love to dress very fancy in public, take a lot of time in their wardrobe, love to display their luxury item, love to show off their social class status. And all of these things in his list, he lists them as virtues about the British as being a very refined people, being very polite and courteous and hospitable. But by the same token, he also lists as a vice the way that the British spend endless amounts of time self-consumed.
Most of the vices that he articulates have to do with lack of generosity and an excessive attention to worldly goods.
The merits are their advances, their achievements, their public institutions, their education. their commerce, their army, their politics. He also believes that these kinds of achievements has come at the expense of losing certain kind of spirituality.
He left London, and this was around June 1802.
Went over to Paris, and then took an overland journey through what's now Turkey.
And eventually to the west coast of India and Bombay, and then back through land to Calcutta. We know very little about what Abu Talib Khan did after his return to India. What we do know, however, is that he never recovered his previous social status as an administrator in the court of Lucknow.
عدت إلى وطني وإلى حالي القديمة من ضيق اليد ووحدة النفس، وحدة أعادت عصف الذكريات إلي، ذكريات الأحداث التي تخلت عني فيها شركة الهند الشرقية التي كنت أعمل لصالحها، والتي حملتني ابتداء على خوض هذه الرحلة، وهذا بيانها. كان أسلوب جباية الضرائب الذي تتبعه شركة الهند الشرقية في ولاية العود فوضوية، وأخذت الواردات تنقص رغم أن جباة الخراج كانوا يأخذون مبالغ أكبر كل مرة من ملتزم الأرض قسرة. في النهاية ثار عدد كبير من الملتزمين والملاك على الشركة، وتصدوا لقوات إنجليزية حاولت قمعهم. ظل ذلك الأمر حتى أمر الحاكم العام آنذاك وممثل شركة الهند الشرقية في المنطقة بإرساله.
He served as local tax collector in Lucknow, and in fact, he was enforcing the East India Company's aggressive policies in the region, and there were rebellions there, and he was not on the side of the rebels.
فتعقبت زعيم الثوار لعامين، وهزمتهم في معارك عدة حتى اقتحمت معسكرهم، بينما هلك زعيمهم خلال محاولته الهرب. في النهاية غادر الحاكم العام، وبقيت أنا في فقري ووحدتي في مواجهة أعدائي. كانت هذه حكايتي قبل رحلتي.
Abu Talib's relationship to what's going on with the British in India and the process of colonization, it cannot be summed up in simply one simple statement, as either he's for empire or against it.
He doesn't have a colonized mind. He still has a very Indian, Persian mind.
The impoverishment of the peasantry, the extraction of revenue, the use of executive military force. He saw this not just in India, he saw this in South Africa, in Ireland. I would say the most valuable lesson of reading Abu Talib, it's not that it is not simply colonial, anti-colonial, it's decolonial.
If we were to say that he was defeated by colonialism, I don't think we would have the sense of his sophisticated resistance.
It is wrong for us to think that this generation of Indian, Iranian, Arab, Muslim travelers were just discovering Europe and they were just flabbergasted how amazing Europe was. This is flawed. They came from a confident civilization. They were discovering the world, including Europe, and they write about everything. He was curious about the whole world. He was mapping the world, not just England. Without forgetting who we are and where we come from, my first name, Abu Talib or Hamid or Nabil, and this is where I was born. But I have a claim over the world. The world is also my home. So if we come to that critical consciousness, it prevents for you to have a colonized mind that we went to Europe and became civilized.